example. So the mass housing complexes and the self-help housing continued post-war. We are still, the Greek state was still trying to settle the refugees in the 50s and 60s. One interesting example here is Eli Vasilikotis' impressive refugee social housing unit in Asylmatos. This is constructed in 1967. So, in the last 2 or 3 decades, part of this surviving refugee housing has transformed into a valued repository of collective memory and a bearer of multiple histories and meanings. A series of factors have contributed to the reframing of this built stock as heritage. Among others, the fading away of the first generation of refugees, the full integration of the next generation into Greek society, the reappreciation of the welfare state in face of its universal retreat, and of course the destruction of the majority of the refugee housing. So gradually, whatever has survived from this whole settlement process has started to be perceived as heritage. Almost none of the slums have survived. Little of this single-floor housing has survived. And then we have, because much of this was replaced by apartment buildings through the Muteahhit system. You can see apartment buildings here at the background of the photograph. So these little houses were demolished and replaced. We have many of the 2-floor housing units, the stone ones that I showed you. Lots of that has survived, and the mass housing complexes that I showed you as well, of the 30s and the 50s. And these buildings are monuments of refugee housing, if you like, but also they are important. They're important. How can I say? Testifiers, like testimonies, products of the Greek modern movement, and they reflect the national and international ideas of the time. So we see here that the history of the refugee settlement process intersects with the history of the modern movement and the history of the welfare state. But on the other hand, we have lots of housing that cannot be recognized as refugee heritage. For example, the self-help housing that I showed you before, like refugees building their own homes, it cannot be distinguished in the city, in the urban landscape as refugee life. Or, of course, the apartment buildings that replace the single-floor houses, they don't have a distinctive refugee appearance that would allow them to be perceived as architectural heritage. So even if they cover large areas, and if all these areas were kind of, they emerged through the refugee settlement process, we can call them a footprint of the exchange, if you like, or a legacy of the exchange, not so much a heritage of the exchange. So there's an interesting question coming here, like what is the form that we assign to refugee heritage? And last, I would just like to point out that this heritagization process has been a bottom-up process, chiefly through the mobilization of refugee associations, civil society groups, academics, architects. They have tried to save what has remained, whereas the state, the official mechanisms and authorities have responded more reluctantly. So today, very few, a tiny part of this refugee stock is actually protected as heritage. It's listed as heritage. So we're still talking of a making of heritage that is in the beginning. It's in beginnings. It's an unofficial heritage still. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this new research that you shared with us. So we are really out of time. We are very late in our program, but all the lectures were extremely interesting, and also because we have visual material, of course, it sort of makes things more longer. So we can take maybe one just question, if, yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear? Calliope.
But you
Okay,
can-
I'll tell you.
Ben bu perspektiften ayrıca dinleyicimiştim. O yüzden sunumda çok dikkatimi çeken unsurlar ve merak ettiğim bir şey oldu. Bu aynı konuttaki iki kapı olayı ki bu gösterdiğimiz son örnekte aslında cepheden ayırt edilemeyecek nitelikte iki kapı aynı konuta ait olduğunu söyleyince açıkçası söylenmesi farkına varacağımız bir durum değildi. Ama Atina'nın içinde cephe karakteri içerisine entegre olmuş şekilde iki kapılı konutlar vardı. Benim de çok ilgimi çekti. Ayvalık'ta bunların nedeni ticaretle uğraşıyor olmaları Rumların, Ayvalık'taki Rumların ve konutu ve ticaret ve konut barınma için çift işlevli kullanıyor olmaları. Şimdi burada galiba sorumun cevabı dinlediğimden öğrendiklerimin içinde yatıyor. İkinci grupta giden mübadillerin yerine yerleştirilen konutlardansa eğer o son gördüğüm acaba o zaman bir ortaklık mı var diye yani Rumların çift kapılı konut yapma geleneğinin her iki tarafta da mevcut olduğunu mu düşünmeliyim diye böyle bir hipotetik bir sonuca doğru giderken hani bunu size ve tabii ki sizlere aktarıp görüşlerinizi almak istedim. Teşekkür
The
ederim.
lady has worked on Ayvalık and the houses left by the Rum Mübadils, and they also have two doors for the single or double floored houses. So she was interested to know if in Athens also this was sort of a characteristic of having two doors of using for entrances for the houses as well, meaning that both the rooms in Ayvalık and those in Athens had the same type of construction of two entrance doors.
The example that I showed was there were two doors because there were two different rooms, so two different families. It wasn't one house with two doors, there were two units side by side. In general, we have tried to understand, this is a very interesting question, we have tried to understand if spatial practices moved across the Aegean, so if architectural features from Anatolia moved to Athens because of the exchange. But the truth is that the conditions were so tragic and so poor and so, like, it was such an emergency situation that the only criterion for construction was
Units.
how do you say, to be cheap, to create cheap construction and to create it fast because people were dying, you know, every week. So they just made the minimum dwellings in the first period, and then gradually over the years, as you saw, the typologies kind of improved. But again, it was cheap and it was minimal.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you
Bye
too.
bye.
Have a great day. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bu uzun 19. yüzyıl gibi uzun oturumu da kapatıyorum. Herkese çok teşekkür ederim.
Şimdi uzun 19. yüzyıl gibi bir oturum olunca Kafa Bile'yi kısa 20. yüzyıl gibi tutuyoruz. 5 dakika hemen alıp kahvelerimizi gelelim.
Yedi buçuk gibi.